first time my daughter brought Marcus home, I was wiping down a 15-year-old sedan in the driveway. He stepped out of a leased coupe, looked at my car, then my house, and said loud enough for me to hear, "So this is where you came from." He smiled the way men smile when they have already decided what you are worth. I said nothing. That was 2 years ago, and if I had corrected his assumption that afternoon, everything that followed would have ended very differently. Not for me, for him. My name is Victor Hale. I am 63 years old. I drive a dented sedan, buy my shirts at warehouse sales, and play chess at the public library. What Marcus could not see that afternoon, what I deliberately kept hidden, was that I am the founder and sole owner of Halcyon Equity Group, a holding company worth $210 million. I built it in silence over 3 decades. My daughter Claire had no idea. Marcus thought I was a retired mechanic. He treated me accordingly, and over the next 12 months, he would make a series of choices that forced my hand, and in the end, he would discover that the man he dismissed in the driveway could dismantle every single thing he was trying to take. Halcyon started with a single laundromat in 1993. I was 34 years old, widowed the year before, raising a 5-year-old Claire alone. My wife Alina had left behind a life insurance payout, $48,000. Most men in my position would have paid down the house or put it in a college fund. Instead, I bought a failing laundromat on Harrison Street with cash and fixed every machine myself over 6 months of nights and weekends. The second location was a dry cleaner, then a parking garage. By the time Claire entered middle school, I owned 11 small businesses, none of them flashy, all of them cash flow positive. I structured everything under a holding company named Halcyon, after the bird Alina had painted on our bedroom wall, the one that meant calm and untroubled. It was a private joke between me and a woman who was no longer there. I wore the same boots for a decade. I did not upgrade my car. When Claire asked why we did not live like her friends' families, I told her that what we had was enough. She accepted that. I made 2 promises to myself the year Alina died. The first was that our daughter would grow up without ever feeling like money defined her worth. The second was that I would never let anyone who cared more about a balance sheet than a heartbeat get close to what Alina and I had dreamed of building. I kept the first promise. The second one would be tested 30 years later in my own driveway by a young man in a leased coupe. Marcus entered Claire's life like a summer storm, sudden and confident and full of light. She met him at a charity gala where she was event coordinator and he was a junior partner at his father's wealth management firm. He was 29, a full 9 years older than her. He spoke in complete paragraphs, remembered people's names, and had a way of touching your shoulder that felt practiced but effective. Within 3 months, Claire was wearing a ring. Within 6, they were talking about a spring wedding. She brought him to Sunday dinners at my house, the same house where Alina and I had raised her, a modest 4-bedroom in a neighborhood that had appreciated quietly over the decades. Marcus would sit at my table and compliment my cooking and ask questions that sounded like curiosity but felt like surveying. He wanted to know how long I had lived there, what the property taxes ran, whether my retirement had been planned or forced. He said it all with such warmth that if you were not paying attention, you would miss the architecture underneath. I was paying attention. I had spent 3 decades reading ledgers and balance sheets, and more importantly, reading the people who moved money from one place to another. Marcus was a man who looked at everything the way an appraiser looks at a house, calculating what it could be worth if certain conditions were met. He was charming, and my daughter was in love, and I told myself repeatedly that maybe I was just being protective. Maybe I was the problem, so I stayed quiet. I asked friendly questions about his work. I listened to him explain the strategies his firm used to help families optimize legacy assets. I learned that his father, Conrad, had built one of the largest independent advisory practices in the state. I learned that Marcus was ambitious in ways that did not announce themselves loudly, but simmered constantly beneath the surface. But here is the thing nobody tells you about reading people. The small tells are the most reliable. And 6 weeks before the wedding, Marcus let a detail slip that I could not unhear. We were on the back porch, just the 2 of us, and he said with a grin that Claire had told him how I had scraped together a little business money back in the day. He said it with genuine admiration, as if he were complimenting a child's lemonade stand. Scraped together. The words landed wrong and stayed wrong. That night, after they left, I opened my laptop and started looking deeper into Marcus Thorne and his father's firm. What I found over the following week did not shock me, but it sharpened something in my chest. Conrad Thorne was not just an advisor. He was what Howard, my attorney, called an asset aggregator. His firm specialized in identifying elderly or unsophisticated property holders, persuading them to consolidate their holdings into managed trusts, and extracting fees at every layer of the transaction. The firm had been investigated twice by state regulators. No convictions, but a thick file of complaints from families who claimed they had been squeezed out of their inheritances. Marcus was being groomed to take over the practice. He had not mentioned any of this to Claire. He had told her his father was a retirement specialist. I did not confront him. I did not tell Claire what I had found. I wanted to see what Marcus would do when he believed nobody was watching. So I stayed exactly as I appeared. I drove the dented sedan. I let him assume the laundry business had been a small, faded operation that left me with a pension and not much else. And I waited. He did not take long to reveal his hand. 2 months after the wedding, during a Sunday lunch, Marcus brought up the idea of Claire and me having a conversation about family financial planning. He said it gently, almost offhand, as if he was suggesting we coordinate holiday travel. He mentioned that his father's firm could set up a straightforward trust arrangement to protect my house from probate and reduce the tax burden. He said it was routine. He said he just wanted to make sure I was protected. Then he looked at Claire and smiled and said, "Your dad has worked too hard for anything to get complicated later." Claire looked at me. I could see in her face that she had heard this pitch before, that Marcus had already seeded the idea. She trusted him. Of course she did. He was her husband. I thanked him for the concern and said I would think about it. That night, I called Howard and told him to begin preparing something that I had never intended to show anyone. Now you need to understand something about how I built Halcyon. I did not build it to be invisible forever. I built it to be ready. Every acquisition was documented. Every trust layer was structured so that Claire's inheritance was protected from creditors, lawsuits, and crucially spouses who had not earned a place at the table. Elena had insisted on that clause, even when Claire was only 10, because Elena had seen her own aunt lose a family business to a man who had married in and bled it dry. I had always hoped I would never need to activate those protections. I had hoped Claire would marry someone like her mother, someone who saw people before numbers. But by the 3rd month of the marriage, Marcus had stopped pretending. He began dropping by unannounced, always with a business card or a brochure from his father's firm. He started asking specific questions about the house's deed, the tax assessment, whether I carried any debt. He used words like liquidity event and reverse equity extraction. He spoke to me like I was an elderly man who needed managing. And every time he did, I nodded and said little and wrote everything down in a notebook I kept in my desk drawer. The break came on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn. Marcus arrived alone. No Claire, no phone call ahead. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car, and he was carrying a manila folder. He sat at my kitchen table and opened the folder and slid a document across the wood. It was a proposed limited partnership agreement, 4 pages of dense legal language. The document listed my house as a contributed asset, the general partners. Marcus and his father Conrad, with 60% control. My name appeared as a limited partner with a 40% interest and no decision-making authority. Marcus explained that this would allow the Thorne family firm to manage the property efficiently, minimize exposure, and eventually help Claire and me both. He said it like he was offering me a gift. I let the document sit between us. I looked at Marcus, at his expensive shirt, his confident smile, his complete certainty that I did not understand what I was looking at, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just the cold, quiet click of a decision locking into place. I told Marcus I would need a few weeks to review it with my attorney. He seemed pleased, as if he had already won. After he left, I opened my desk drawer and took out the folder Howard had prepared. Inside was a summary document, a single page listing every holding under Halcyon Equity Group: real estate, private equity stakes, cash reserves, total estimated value $210 million. And attached to it was the original trust document, signed and notarized the year Elena died, naming Claire as sole beneficiary, with language so airtight that no spouse could ever touch a single dollar without her explicit consent and independent legal counsel. I had protected her from predators before she was old enough to know one existed. I picked up Marcus's partnership agreement and held it next to my summary sheet. His document was an attempt to take a house he thought was my only asset. He had no idea that the house was one of 27 properties. He had no idea that the man he was trying to swindle had already built a fortress around what mattered. And he had absolutely no idea that in 14 days, I was planning a family meeting where his entire understanding of my life would collapse in real time. But before that meeting could happen, Marcus did something I did not expect, something that turned a financial confrontation into something much more dangerous. He went to Claire with a story, and the story was about me. The story Marcus told Claire was simple, careful, and completely wrong. He sat her down in their living room 3 days after I had received his partnership agreement, and with visible concern, explained that he was worried about my mental state. He said I had been forgetting details during our conversations, repeating myself, getting confused about dates. He said that when he had tried to talk to me about practical financial matters, I had grown defensive and suspicious in ways that were not rational. He told her he was afraid I might be in the early stages of cognitive decline and that someone needed to step in before I made a disastrous decision with the house or whatever savings I had left. He did not raise his voice once. He did not sound like a man making an accusation. He sounded like a husband who loved his wife and feared for her father. Claire called me the next evening. She said she wanted to check in just to see how I was doing. Her voice was different, gentle in the way people are gentle when they have already been convinced you are fragile. She asked if I had been sleeping. She asked if I had been forgetting appointments. She said Marcus had mentioned that I seemed a little off during their last visit, and she was worried. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach. Not panic, recognition. I had seen this maneuver before, not directed at me but at other men my age, men whose families were quietly dismantled by people like the Thorns. You plant a question, you water it with concern, and eventually the person closest to the target becomes your tool. My own daughter was being turned into a witness against me, and she did not even know it. I told Claire I was fine. I told her I had been busy with some paperwork, but nothing unusual. She hesitated. She said Marcus thought it might be a good idea if I spoke with a doctor, just a routine cognitive checkup, nothing serious. She said it the way you suggest a flu shot. I said I would think about it. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The same table where I had raised her, taught her to read, held her when she cried about her mother. And now her husband had aimed her at me like a weapon. I called Howard, not the next morning, that night at 10 o'clock. He picked up because Howard always picks up. I told him what had happened. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Victor, this is not about the house anymore. They are building a competency case." I had already reached the same conclusion, but hearing it from an attorney with 30 years of experience made it real in a way that tightened my chest. Howard explained the playbook. Step 1, isolate the elderly person from anyone who might contradict the narrative. Step 2, accumulate documentation of supposed confusion or impaired judgment, emails, notes, witness accounts. Step 3, file for conservatorship or guardianship with family member support. Step 4, once the court grants control, liquidate everything. It was a legal machine, and Marcus and his father had been running it for years. I asked Howard what our options were. He said the strongest defense was a clean, documented financial history that demonstrated long-term competence. He said I had that in abundance, 3 decades of tax returns, acquisition records, trust documents, all of it showing methodical, intelligent wealth management. He said that if it came to a legal fight, we would win. But he also said something else that stayed with me. He said, "Victor, you can win in court and still lose your daughter." Competency cases don't just attack the mind, they attack the relationship. If she believes him, a legal victory might not bring her back. That was the pivot. Until that moment, I had been thinking about this as a financial defense. Protect the assets, protect the trust, reveal the truth, but Howard had just named the real cost. I could crush Marcus in any legal arena. I could display my portfolio and watch his face fall, but if Claire had already been poisoned against me, the victory would be hollow. I needed to reach her first, and I was already running out of time. 3 days later, Marcus escalated. He sent a formal letter, not to me, to my family physician. He introduced himself as my son-in-law, expressed deep concern about my capacity to manage my own health and financial decisions, and requested a confidential consultation. He CC'd the letter to an attorney whose name I recognized from Howard's file on Conrad Thorne's firm. It was the attorney who had represented them in the 2 prior state investigations. Marcus was no longer hiding. He was building a record. But he made his first mistake. He sent that letter on a Friday, and he did not know that my family physician, Dr. Elaine Chu, had known me for 22 years, had treated Alina through her illness, and had already been notified by Howard's office 2 weeks earlier to expect contact. She called me immediately. She sounded angry on my behalf. She said she had received a letter that was transparently predatory, and she wanted to know what she should do. I thanked her. I asked her to save everything, to document the contact, and to promise me that if anyone ever questioned my competence in a legal proceeding, she would testify truthfully about what she had seen. She gave me her word without hesitation. That weekend, Claire came to the house alone. It was the first time I had seen her without Marcus in 4 months. She looked tired in a way that hurt to see, dark circles, a tension in her jaw that I recognized from Alina's face during the hard years. She sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around a coffee mug, and for a long time she did not speak. I waited. I have learned that waiting is the most powerful tool a man can possess. Most people will fill silence with the truth if you give them room. Eventually she said, "Dad, Marcus is telling me things about you that I don't want to believe." Her voice cracked on the word believe. She said he had been showing her notes from their conversations, dates and details of things I had supposedly forgotten or confused. She said he had suggested that I might need to move into an assisted living facility for my own safety and that the house should be sold to pay for it. She said he had already contacted a real estate agent. She said he told her this was the hardest decision a family could make, but that he would handle everything, that she did not need to carry the burden alone because that was what husbands did. I looked at my daughter, the child I had taught to ride a bicycle in that driveway, the woman who had planned her own wedding with more care than I had seen her give anything, and I realized that Marcus had not just been trying to steal my house, he had been trying to erase me, to turn me into a problem that needed to be managed and then removed. His endgame was not a partnership agreement. It was a conservatorship, a forced sale of assets he believed were uncomplicated, and a wife who was too grateful to ask questions. I reached across the table and took Claire's hand. I said, "Sweetheart, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago, and once I tell you, you are going to understand why Marcus has been doing everything he has been doing, but I need you to promise me something first." She looked at me and her eyes were wet. She said, "What?" I said, "I need you to sit here and listen to all of it, not just the money part, the part about your mother. The part about why I made the choices I made, because if you only hear the numbers, you will miss the reason, and the reason is the only thing that matters." She nodded, and then I told her, not the summary sheet, not yet. I told her about the laundromat on Harrison Street, about the nights I spent fixing dryers while she slept on a cot in the back office, about the first apartment building I bought in 1997, a crumbling 6-unit that nobody wanted, and how I rebuilt it with my own hands over 2 years, about the deals I walked away from because they would have compromised what her mother and I had agreed on. I told her Halcyon was not a small business her father had scraped together. It was a holding company with 27 commercial and residential properties, private equity stakes in 4 regional manufacturing firms, and cash reserves in excess of $40 million. I told her that her mother had designed the trust herself, sitting at this very table, and that the trust made Claire the sole heir to everything. And I told her that the document Marcus had asked me to sign was an attempt to take control of the house, the smallest piece of what I owned, because he and his father believed it was all I had. Claire was silent for a full minute. Then she asked a question I had not expected. She said, "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" I told her the truth. I said I had been afraid that if she knew the scale of it, she would never know if someone loved her or her inheritance. I said her mother and I had agreed that she should marry someone who saw her, not her balance sheet. And I said that by the time I realized Marcus was not that person, I had already let the silence go on too long. I told her I was sorry for that. for the silence, for letting her walk into a marriage with a man who had been running a calculation from the first handshake. She started to cry, not the way people cry at sad movies, but the way people cry when something they believed about their life turns out to be scaffolding over a hole. She said she had noticed things, the way Marcus talked about money, the way he dismissed people he thought were unimportant, the way he had started pressuring her to have fewer calls with me to let him handle the family logistics. She said she had told herself these were small things, that she was being overly sensitive, that marriage required trust, and all the while, her trust had been the mechanism he was using. We talked until it was dark outside. She asked me what would happen next. I said I had a plan. I said Howard had prepared everything we needed to stop Marcus legally, and that I had enough documentation to dismantle any competency claim before it reached a courtroom. But I also said that the legal fight was not the one I cared about most. I cared about her. I asked her if she still trusted Marcus. She did not answer right away. She looked at the table, and I could see her turning over every memory, every conversation, every time he had told her something that now looked different. Finally, she said she did not know. She said she did not know what was real anymore. And that was the moment I understood that Marcus had already done the worst damage he could do. It was not financial. It was the doubt he had planted in my daughter's heart about herself. I told her we would figure it out together, that I would not let him hurt her any further. I asked her to stay at the house that night, and she did. She slept in her childhood bedroom, under the same ceiling her mother had painted with stars when she was 7. I did not sleep. I sat in my study and reviewed every document Howard had prepared. I mapped out the sequence of what would come next, and I made a decision. The original plan had been to wait for the family meeting, to let Marcus walk into the room believing he was the predator and discover he was the prey. But after what he had done to Claire, waiting was no longer enough. I was not just going to reveal my hand. I was going to dismantle his, every asset he thought he had, every connection he relied on, every assumption his father's firm was built on. I was going to make sure that when Marcus Thorne tried to take something from someone again, he would remember what it cost him the first time. The next morning, Claire came downstairs with her eyes clearer than they had been in months. She said she had made a decision of her own. She wanted to be in the room when it happened. She wanted to see his face when he understood that she knew everything. I told her it would be hard. She said she had already done the hard part. She had spent 6 months doubting her own judgment, and she was done. That afternoon, Howard arrived at the house with 2 associates and a locked briefcase containing the full Halcyon file. The summary sheet, the trust documents, the property records, the tax filings, and a forensic accounting report Howard had commissioned, which traced every entity in Conrad Thorne's advisory network and identified 17 clients who had filed complaints, 6 pending civil suits, and 1 active investigation that had not yet become public. Marcus thought he was hunting an old man with a pension. He had no idea that the old man had spent 6 weeks building a counter-strike that reached into every corner of his family's firm. I picked up the phone and called Marcus. When he answered, I kept my voice calm. I told him Claire and I had been talking, and we thought it would be a good idea if he came to the house that evening so we could go over the partnership agreement together. I said I had reviewed it carefully and wanted to discuss some modifications. Marcus sounded pleased, the kind of pleasure that comes from believing you are about to close a deal. He said he would be there at 6. I hung up and looked at Claire. She met my eyes and said, "Let's finish this." But there was one thing I had not accounted for, one piece of information that would change everything about how this confrontation would unfold. Marcus was not coming alone, and the person he was bringing with him was someone I had not spoken to in 28 years. At 5 minutes before 6, a black sedan pulled into my driveway, and the man who stepped out behind Marcus was my brother-in-law, Daniel, Elena's younger brother. I had not seen him since her funeral. 28 years of silence, and now he was walking toward my door with the man who was trying to destroy me. I opened the door before they knocked. Marcus introduced Daniel as if he were a surprise gift. "Victor, I believe you know Daniel. When I mentioned to my father the family situation, he thought it might be helpful to bring in someone who knows you from the old days, someone who can support what we are trying to do." Daniel shook my hand. His grip was the same as I remembered, too firm, too long, a handshake that wanted to prove something. He had aged hard. His face was thinner, the lines around his mouth deeper. He was wearing a suit that did not quite fit, the kind a man borrows for court, and I understood immediately why he was there. The Thorns had found him, promised him something, and inserted him into the narrative as a corroborating witness. They were not just building a competency case anymore, they were building a history. I let them in. Claire was already in the living room with Howard and his associates. When she saw Daniel, her face went pale. She had been 12 the last time she saw her uncle. He had disappeared from our lives so completely that she had stopped asking about him years ago. Now he was standing in her father's living room, allied with her husband, and the geometry of the room shifted into something hostile. Marcus took a seat at the head of the table without being invited. He opened a leather folder and began laying out documents. He explained that Daniel had reached out after hearing from a mutual acquaintance that my mental state had become a family concern. He said Daniel had shared recollections of my behavior during Elena's illness, episodes of erratic decision-making, emotional volatility, a pattern that was concerning even back then. He said it gently, the way a prosecutor says things that sound like sympathy. Daniel nodded at the appropriate moments, his eyes never meeting mine. I let Marcus talk. He described a plan where Daniel would serve as a co-trustee on a new management structure for my assets alongside the Thorn firm. He said this would ensure family oversight and protect Claire from the burden of managing things herself. He said the partnership agreement was still on the table, but given new information about my history, a more comprehensive arrangement was clearly necessary. He said the word comprehensive the way a surgeon says procedure. When he finished, the room was silent. Claire was gripping the arm of her chair. Howard had not moved. Daniel was looking at the floor, and I realized that this was the worst turn, not the partnership agreement, not the competency case alone, but the weaponization of my own history. They had gone into the past and found the one person who could lend credibility to a story of instability, a man whose resentment had been marinating for 28 years, who had blamed me for his sister's death in ways he never spoke aloud but never released. I stood up. I told Marcus I appreciated his thoroughness. I told Daniel it was good to see him, and I meant it in the way you mean things that are true but carry no warmth. Then I said that before we went any further, there were some documents I needed to share. I nodded to Howard. He opened his briefcase and began distributing folders. The first document was the Halcyon summary sheet. Marcus picked it up and I watched his face. It did not collapse. It did not flash with shock. It simply went very still, the way a machine stops when something jams. He read the total valuation. He read the list of properties and holdings. He read it again, and then he looked up at me with an expression that was no longer confident, no longer smooth. It was the look of a man who had just realized he had been playing chess against someone who had already seen every move he could make. Daniel leaned over to look at Marcus's copy, and his expression was different. It was not calculation, it was pure confusion. He said, "Elena never mentioned any of this." I told him Elena had been the one who designed the trust. I told him she had made the decisions about how our daughter would be protected. I told him that the instability Marcus was referring to from those years was grief, a husband losing his wife, not a man losing his mind. And I said I was sorry he had carried whatever he had carried for so long, but I would not let him be used as a tool against his sister's daughter. Howard placed the second document on the table. It was the forensic accounting report, 17 pages detailing Conrad Thorn's advisory network, the complaints, the civil suits, and the active investigation. Marcus's face changed again. The stillness cracked. He said, "Where did you get this?" Howard answered before I could. "Public records, Mr. Thorn, and some that are not yet public. The firm is facing a state subpoena. It was filed 3 days ago. You may not have been informed yet." Marcus turned to look at Daniel, as if Daniel might somehow salvage the moment, but Daniel was staring at the summary sheet, still trying to process what $210 million meant for a man he had spent decades believing was ordinary. The alliance Marcus had constructed was falling apart in real time, and he could feel it. Claire spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady in a way that made me proud. She asked Marcus when he had first contacted Daniel. Marcus did not answer. She asked again, and this time she did not use his name. She said, "When did you contact my uncle behind my back?" Marcus said it had been a few weeks ago. He said it quickly, the way people admit things they hope will sound smaller than they are. Claire asked if he had ever intended to tell her. He looked at his hands. That was his answer. Then Daniel did something I did not expect. He stood up. He looked at me directly for the first time since he had walked through the door, and he said, "I didn't know what they were doing. They told me you were sick. They told me Claire needed help." He said he had believed them because believing them was easier than admitting he had been wrong about me for 28 years. He said he was sorry. I told him I heard him. I did not tell him it was okay because it was not okay. But I heard him. Marcus gathered his documents quickly, his hands unsteady. He said he thought it was best if they continued this conversation another time with his father present. Howard told him there would not be another time. He said the family was withdrawing from any further discussions with the Thorne firm, and that if Marcus or Conrad attempted any legal action, conservatorship, guardianship, or otherwise, we would respond with a countersuit that included the forensic report, the state investigation, and documented evidence of elder financial abuse. He said the words, elder financial abuse, slowly, letting each syllable land. Marcus looked at Claire. He said her name once softly, the way you call to someone who is supposed to be on your side. She did not look at him. She said, "I think you should leave now." He stood there for a moment longer, a man who had walked in believing he was about to close the biggest deal of his career and was walking out with his marriage, his reputation, and his family's firm in ruins. Then he turned and walked out the door. Daniel followed him without looking back. The room was quiet. Claire was shaking. I put my hand on her shoulder and she covered it with her own. We sat there as the evening light came through the window, the same gold light Elena had loved, and I felt something release in my chest that I had been holding for months. The battle was over, but the war for what remained of my daughter's marriage, for the truth she would now have to carry, for the years of silence that had almost cost us everything, that war was just beginning. Howard and his associates gathered the documents and left quietly. Claire stayed. We made dinner together, the way we used to when she was a teenager, moving around the same kitchen in a rhythm that required no words. She asked me about her mother, not about the money or the trust, but about Elena, what she was like before she got sick, what she believed in, why she had insisted on the protections that had just saved us. I told her everything. For the first time in 28 years, I told her everything. And as I spoke, I watched my daughter begin the slow work of rebuilding herself, not as the woman Marcus had tried to shape, but as the daughter of a mother who had seen the future and a father who had been patient enough to wait for the right moment. The collapse of Conrad Thorne's firm began quietly and then all at once. The state investigation Howard had mentioned was not the only one. 3 days after the confrontation at my house, a second regulatory body opened a parallel inquiry into the firm's conservatorship filings across 4 counties. The pattern was unmistakable. Elderly clients, isolated from family, pressured into signing over control of their assets to Thorne-managed trusts. Marcus had learned the playbook from his father, and his father had been running it for 15 years. Within 6 weeks, the firm announced it was closing its doors. Within 8, Conrad Thorne had retained a criminal defense attorney. Marcus was named in 2 of the civil suits. His name, which he had worn like a credential his entire adult life, had become a liability. Claire filed for divorce in the 2nd month after the confrontation. She did it cleanly, without drama, with the same steady clarity I had seen in her at the kitchen table. She told me later that the hardest part was not signing the papers, but accepting that the man she had married had never existed. The charm, the warmth, the careful attention, it had all been technique. What remained underneath was a man who had looked at her father and seen only a number. She said she had asked Marcus once, in their final conversation, what he had actually felt for her. He could not answer. She said that silence would stay with her longer than any words could have, but it also confirmed that leaving was right. The divorce settlement was straightforward. They had been married less than a year. There were no shared children, no jointly held property of significance. What Claire wanted was not money but distance. Howard handled the paperwork, and within 90 days it was finished. Marcus moved out of the apartment and into his father's house, the house that was now listed for sale to cover mounting legal fees. The leased coupe was returned. The suits went into storage. A man who had spent his entire career positioning himself as an authority on wealth had no wealth left to manage. But the aftermath was not only financial. What Marcus had tried to do had done damage that could not be resolved by a court filing. For weeks after the confrontation, Claire was quiet in ways that worried me. Not depressed, not withdrawn, but rebuilding. She would come to the house on Sunday mornings the way she had before the marriage, and we would drink coffee on the back porch, and sometimes we would talk for hours about her mother. I told her things I had not told anyone in 28 years. How Elena had known about the Halcyon Trust before I did. How she had insisted on the spousal exclusion clause, not because she distrusted anyone specific, but because she believed that love, real love, should not need to pass through a legal filter. She had wanted Claire to marry someone who would never need to know about the money because the money would not matter. I told Claire that her mother had been right about almost everything. And I told her that I had failed to carry that wisdom forward because I had been too protective, too slow, too comfortable in my silence. Claire listened. She did not absolve me, and I did not ask her to. She said she understood why I had done what I did, and she also wished I had done it differently. Both things could be true. That was maturity, and I watched her grow into it week by week. Then in the 4th month after the confrontation, something unexpected happened. Daniel called. I had not spoken to him since he walked out of my house behind Marcus. He asked if we could meet, not at my home, somewhere neutral. I chose the diner on Clement Street where I had been eating breakfast for 20 years. He arrived early, sitting in a booth by the window, and when I sat down across from him, I saw that the hardness in his face had softened. Not disappeared, but receded. He told me that after the evening at my house, he had gone home and sat with what he had learned for a long time. He said he had spent 28 years believing a version of me that was incomplete. He had blamed me for Elena's death, not rationally, he admitted, but in the way people blame the person who was there when the worst thing happened. He said the Thorns had found him through a family connection, fed him the story about my supposed decline, and offered him a role in the solution, a small trustee fee, a chance to be involved again in Claire's life, a way to be useful. He said he had wanted so badly to be useful that he had not asked the right questions. He said he was ashamed. I sat with his words. For a long moment, I did not know what I felt. 28 years is a long time to carry someone's resentment without knowing it, but I thought about what I had told Nathan in my own story, in the original version of this, in the life I had lived before. Shame was only useful if it led somewhere. I told Daniel I was not angry. I told him I had been watchful and careful and maybe a little too satisfied at the end of it, but I did not hate him. I told him he was Elena's brother, and that meant he was still family, and I had not given up on family in 63 years, and I was not about to start now. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet in a way I had not seen since the funeral. We did not hug. We were not that kind of men, but we shook hands before he left, and this time his grip was not too firm. It was just a handshake, the way it should have been all along. Howard called me the following week with the final piece. The forensic accounting report had been subpoenaed by the state, and the investigation into Conrad Thorn had expanded to include 15 additional firms that had partnered with his practice over the years. It was no longer just the Thorns facing consequences. It was a web. Marcus, stripped of his partnership, had moved out of state. He was working in a junior position at a firm that did not yet know his history, but Howard said that would not last. The legal community in this state was small, and word traveled. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt what I had felt at the kitchen table during the confrontation, the quiet click of something locking into place. A man who had spent his career preying on the vulnerable had been stopped. Not by regulators, not by prosecutors, but by an old man in a dented sedan who had been paying attention. But the most important consequence was not legal or financial. It was Claire. 6 months after the divorce, she came to me with an idea. She wanted to learn the business. Not the money, she said. She already understood the money. She wanted to learn the thing her mother had designed, the trust, the structure, the way it had been built to protect not just assets but people. She said she had spent the past months thinking about what kind of life she wanted, and she had realized that the life Marcus had offered was small. It was about accumulation without purpose, status without substance. She wanted to build something that mattered. She asked if I would teach her. We started the following Monday at the kitchen table where Elena had designed the original trust. I walked her through every property, every investment, every decision that had been made over 3 decades. I told her about the mistakes, The building I had almost lost, the deal I had almost gotten wrong, the times when patience had been the only asset I had left. She took notes, she asked questions. And as the weeks passed, I watched her transform from a woman recovering from a betrayal into a woman preparing to carry something forward. She was her mother's daughter. I had always known that, but I had never seen it so clearly. Near the end of that first year after the confrontation, Claire asked me why I had never sold the sedan. She said she had been meaning to ask for years. I told her the truth. I told her that the car ran fine and I liked it, and that there was something about driving a vehicle that nobody looked twice at that kept me honest. I told her that her mother used to say you should not wear what you have, you should just have it. The sedan was not about pretending to be ordinary. It was about remembering where I started. She smiled. She said that was very me. I said I knew. One evening, she asked if I ever thought about what would have happened if I had told her everything earlier. If I had sat her down the day she got engaged and showed her the summary sheet and explained the trust. I said I thought about it often. I said I had replayed the timeline more times than I could count. The moment in the driveway when Marcus first dismissed me. The Sunday lunches when he started probing. The months I spent watching and waiting and saying nothing. I told her that I had made a mistake by staying quiet too long and that the mistake had almost cost me her. But I also told her something else. I told her that silence had also given Marcus all the space he needed to reveal who he truly was. If I had shown my hand on day one, he would have simply adjusted. He would have played a longer game, hidden his intentions more carefully. The silence, however accidental, had functioned as a filter. It had let the threat become visible. And once it was visible, I could end it. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I will never forget. She said, "So what you are telling me is that Mom built the fortress and you waited to see who would try to climb the walls." I told her that was exactly right. She looked at the kitchen window, where the evening light was coming through the glass in that particular gold Elena had always loved, and she said, "I want to be the kind of person who builds fortresses, not the kind who tests them." That was the moment I knew she would be fine, not because she had my money or Elena's trust, but because she had figured out the thing that matters most. You do not build walls because you distrust people. You build them so that the people who get through are the ones who were never trying to take anything in the first place. The final piece of the resolution came quietly, almost unnoticed. On the one-year anniversary of the confrontation, I received a letter from a woman I had never met. Her name was Margaret. She was the daughter of one of Conrad Thorne's earliest clients, a retired school teacher who had signed over his house to a Thorne trust and spent his final years in a facility that drained his savings. She wrote that she had read about the investigation in a news article and she had seen my name in the court filings. She wanted to thank me. She said her father had died feeling like a fool and she had carried that weight for years. She said knowing that someone had finally held the Thornes accountable meant more than she could express. I read the letter 3 times. I put it in the folder where I kept Elena's trust documents because it belonged with the things that mattered. I am 63 years old. I still drive the dented sedan. I still buy my shirts at warehouse sales. I still play chess at the public library on Thursdays. Nothing about how I live has changed because nothing needed to change. The life I built with Elena, the life I protected for our daughter, was never about display. It was about what lasts. And what has lasted is this: a holding company worth $210 million, a daughter who is learning to run it, a trust that cannot be broken by anyone who marries into the family without earning a place at the table, and the knowledge that the man who tried to take everything ended up with nothing. But there is one detail I have not mentioned, one piece of the story that even Claire does not know yet. The morning before the confrontation, I updated my will, and in the new version, I added a provision Elena had never considered: a small fund, separate from the main trust, designated for the victims of Conrad Thorne's firm, the families who lost houses, inheritances, years of their lives. It is not restitution. Restitution would require the Thornes to pay what they owe, and they never will. But it is something, a way of ensuring that what Marcus tried to do to me becomes, in the end, a source of repair for people he actually hurt. I have not told anyone about this except Howard. I will tell Claire soon. She will understand. She is her mother's daughter. And Elena, if she were here, would have said exactly what I am about to say. You do not just build the fortress. You make sure it serves something beyond yourself, otherwise it is just walls. I am telling you this story not because it is unusual, but because it is not. For every man like me, 63 years old, quiet, easy to overlook, there are 100 others. Men who built something slowly while the world measured them by their cars. Women who hold keys to empires in purses bought at discount stores. People who learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful, and that money you have to announce is money you have already spent. Marcus made the mistake of thinking that what he could see was all there was. He is not the only one who makes that mistake. The world trains us to read surfaces. The surfaces lie constantly. What happened in my driveway 2 years ago was not a clash of wealth. It was a collision of philosophies. One philosophy says, display what you have so people know your value. The other says, build what matters so well that it cannot be taken, and let the people who need to underestimate you do exactly that. I did not invent that second philosophy. My wife Alina did. She understood something that took me decades to fully grasp. The best protection is not a strong offense. It is a quiet foundation that nobody sees until they have already revealed their intentions. By the time Marcus showed me his partnership agreement, he had told me everything I needed to know about who he was. The silence I kept was not weakness. It was a door I left open so that he could walk through it and show me exactly what he planned to do. And here is the part that matters most, the part I hope you carry with you after this story ends. The money was never the point, not really. The money was a tool and the tool worked. But what I almost lost was not $210 million. It was Claire. It was my daughter's ability to trust herself. That was the real damage Marcus tried to inflict, and that was the wound that took the longest to heal. Fortunes can be rebuilt. Trust, once broken in the right place, is nearly impossible to reassemble. I got lucky. I got to Claire before the story Marcus planted had time to take root. Not everyone gets that chance. Some families lose each other over far less. So the question this story leaves behind is not about how much money a person has. It is about what we assume when we look at someone, a neighbor, a father-in-law, a man in a dented sedan. What do we decide about their worth before they have said a single word? And what might we miss if we make that decision too quickly? Marcus made that decision in my driveway before he even shook my hand. It cost him his marriage, his career, and his family's firm. But more than that, it cost him the chance to be part of something real. Because the truth is, if he had come to me honestly, if he had sat at my table and said, Victor, I want to build a life with your daughter and I want to understand what that means, I would have shown him everything. Slowly, carefully, the way I have always done things. The door was open. He never bothered to walk through it. He chose the window instead. I still live in the same house. I still drive the same sedan. Claire is now managing 3 of the Halcyon properties and learning the rest. She has become, in ways that surprise even me, the exact kind of person her mother hoped she would be. Not a woman who flaunts what she has. A woman who knows how to protect it and who understands that the real inheritance is not the number on the summary sheet. It is the 37 years of decisions that produced that number. The discipline, the patience, the willingness to be underestimated. If this story meant something to you, if you recognize yourself in it, or someone you love, or someone you may have misjudged, then take one thing from it. Pay attention, not to the obvious, to the quiet. The people worth knowing are often the ones who do not announce themselves. And the people worth protecting yourself against are often the ones who smile too easily and ask too many questions about things that are not theirs. Thank you for listening. If you want to see more stories about what happens when the underestimated finally speak, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because the world is full of people like me, and one of them might be sitting right next to you.